University. I'd like to welcome you to the 2013 Hollywood Lecture. This week, Monash University is proud to host the Astronomical Society of Australia's annual scientific meeting. And there has been and will be much discussion of the latest developments in the science of planets, asteroids, stars, galaxies, supernova, and mysterious objects beyond. The lecture honours Harley Wood, the first president of the Astronomical Society of Australia, and for 3 decades the director of Sydney Observatory, which is just a stone's throw away from the Sydney Harbour Bridge. This year's Harley Wood lecturer is Associate Professor Charley Lineweaver of the Australian National University. He has a diverse education with degrees majoring in English and clearly history as well, in addition to his expertise in astrophysics. Since completing his PhD in 1994 at Berkeley in California, he has been exceptionally broad and active in his research. He has speculated about how common life is in our universe. He has contemplated the number of stars, planets, and brown dwarfs in our galaxy. He has written on the age of the universe for the esteemed journal Science, and he's even got the answer correct, or at least we think he has. He is thus exceptionally qualified to present tonight's Hollywood lecture, The Birth, Life and Death of Our Planet and of the Universe. So please welcome Associate Professor Charley Lineweaver.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Sound okay? All right. So I thought I'd let you look at me for 5 seconds before I turn the lights out, so you know who's talking. So yes, I'm Charley Lineweaver, and I'll be going around in the dark up here. We only have 2 settings. It's anyway. Here's the light. Okay. Will that turn down the lights? All right. So this is. I turned it down because it's such a beautiful image, and this was painted about 400 years ago, and it has to do with the triumph of death. And you can see that a lot of people are being killed by I guess skeletons. And so we all have somatic bodies, and we're going to die. And life can tell us a lot about birth and death. And so I'm going to talk, the first part of my talk will be discussing life and the insights into life and death that it can tell us. But then I'll apply that to a planet in our star, and then to galaxies, and then to the whole universe, and potentially the multiverse. So the birth, life, and death of our planet. I like this diagram because, as you can see, the last thing standing will be a telephone pole. And that seems so ridiculous to me. And here's me. All right, so birth and death. Well, our bodies, the body that you have, the body that you're thinking with right now, is going to die. And our Earth and Sun, and in general, stars and planets around them are going to die because the Sun, uses up hydrogen, burns it into helium, and so that hydrogen will run out. Milky Way galaxy, we don't usually think of galaxies dying, but what is going on in a galaxy is that mass is slowly accreting, and most galaxies that we know of have central black holes in them, and mass is accreting onto them, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And you could call a galaxy, when most or some large fraction of its mass falls into that central black hole, we can call that the death of the galaxy. On the other hand, those black holes eventually will evaporate. And you could call that, then the universe will reach an equilibrium, and we can call that the death of the universe. And then about whether the multiverse will ever die or not, I have no idea. I thought it was an interesting question, and so I just listed it there. If you'd like to think about that, be my guest. Now, here's some evidence that people are born and die. No loitering. Here's some more evidence. You can see there's an old person here and a young person and somebody in between. And these people have bodies, and these bodies have genes in them which presumably were passed down by these bodies which are now dead. And so there's a distinction to be made between your soma, your body, and your germline, which is in your testes and your ovaries. Those are the immortal parts of you, and the mortal parts of you are the brain and your stomach and everything else. So when I say the word soma, I'm talking about the part that will die, and when I talk about the germline, that's the part that gets passed on. So here's some more evidence that people get old. And here's my best piece of evidence, I think, is this. So, now this is what happens to people. Now, I should point out that this is unusual. This is not always the case. There are different types of aging. Let me show you that again. That's so good. Okay. This is a real picture of when he was a boy there. Anyway, so as an astrobiologist, I like to show this diagram for people who are not familiar with all of life. This is one diagram that shows you the entire phylogenetic tree of all life. However, I should whisper, viruses are not included in this diagram. So here we have bacteria and archaea. This is a group, a whole domain of life was discovered about 25 years ago by Carl Sagan, and these are all prokaryotes. That means they, A, do not have mitochondria in their bodies. That's what you're doing. When you're breathing, everybody's breathing in here, and the reason you're breathing is you're putting oxygen into your cells, and then that oxygen is then taken care of by a nice little thing called a mitochondria, which is right here. This is an alpha proteobacteria, which was clever enough to get incorporated right here, and so all of these life forms, these eukaryotes, these are life forms with nuclei and membranes around their DNA. They all have these mitochondria on the inside. So that's what that's what they are inside each cell in your body. And so in some sense, you are a bacterium. And here's an interesting comment on a life, and that is, here's Homo, this is Homo sapiens. These represents all of animals. Here's Coprinus. This is like a mushroom, and it represents all fungus. And here's Zea, this is corn. This represents all the macroscopic plants. So right here is all the life that is usually studied in high school, or elementary school, or middle school. So, and we have dates on this divergence time, and it's about 1.4 between us and mushrooms, and 1.6 plus or minus 0.2 or so between us and plants. And so this is all of life, and you notice that the red, what we did there in 2003, we created a thermometer out of the phylogenetic tree of life. And everything here is hyperthermophilic. They love temperatures above 90 degrees. When you took a shower this morning or yesterday, you don't let the water get above 60. You are a eukaryote. If you get it above 60, then you start to denature your proteins, and it hurts. These guys have no problem with those temperatures, 75, 90, oh, even 90, even above 90, these guys. So this is some of the evidence that we have for the origin of life about 4 billion years ago was hyperthermophilic, heat-loving. So here we have 1.6 billion, and here about 4 billion, and so you can do the math here. And I wanted to point out that death, these guys don't die. These guys are immortal. They can get killed. I mean, if I go like this right now, I'm killing thousands of bacteria that were on my finger. Matter of fact, the cells, you have about 50 trillion cells. Even for an astronomer, that's a large number. 50 trillion cells in your body, and about another factor of 10 more, so 500 trillion bacterium inside your head and in your gut and all over you. So 10 times as many bacterial cells as there are your own cells. So in some sense, you're more of a bacterium than you are whatever you think you are. But I did want to point out that these guys do not have sex, right? And they don't die. And that tells you something, that sex and death are linked to each other. And I think that's a very important insight that you laugh, it's true. These guys do not have sex. As a matter of fact, I'll show you how these guys are, they're immortal. And imagine you could just divide in half and divide in half. You keep eating, you divide in half and divide in half. And so, in some sense, you may be diluting yourself, but not diluting yourself, but diluting yourself. You're living forever. And so here's a picture of that. I hope it works. It may not. Let's see. What I'm going to show you is these are Ecoli bacteria. Let me show you where Ecoli are here. Ecoli are right, Escherichia coli right there. So this is a type of bacteria that you have all in your colon and your intestines. And let's see if it works. Now, before I press the button and see, the audio of this thing says, if these divide every 20 minutes, then it will, in a day, produce 5,000 billion, which is 5 times 10 to the 21. And for those of you familiar with cosmology, that's about the number of stars in the entire observable universe. So if a bacteria had enough food, it would just divide and divide and divide. So we're talking about 2 to the nth power, where n is 24 hours divided by 20 minutes. So I'm not sure what that number is, but in any case, it's supposed to turn out to that. Now let's see if this thing works. So you can see these bacteria elongating, dividing, elongating and dividing. Does it work? Yes.
Dividing every 20 minutes could produce nearly 5,000 billion bacteria in one day.
It's a lot of food they would have to do that. But anyway, the point is, though, that these guys do not have a built-in senescence program. They don't get old like Mick Jagger. They just get killed, and they starve to death. But they do not are not programmed to die like we are. So that's the bacteria. But also, there are different kinds of death even among eukaryotes. And here we have, let's say, there's something called negligible senescence. If you don't know what that is, Google it. And here's a planarian flatworm. And this guy just gets old, he matures, but there's not an increased probability of dying when you get old. People, get to be 80, 90, 100. There's a higher probability of dying. These guys get to be the equivalent of 80 and 90. They just keep on going. But then eventually they get killed. So it's what's called negligible senescence. This one is a really weirdo. This is the hydrozoan Turritopsis nutricula. It goes from being like a fetus, it matures, and then it can reverse that, like Benjamin Button, just go back to a fetus again, and it can mature again, and then go back again. And it's one of the weirdest things, and people would love to know how to do this, because then we could all be immortal in the same way, but I'm not sure that would solve the population problem. Okay, so there are different types of death, and so I think life has something to teach us about sex, death, and the different types of dying. Now, I want to also show you that you may have noticed, I told you that you have 50 trillion cells, and these guys are single cells, single cells, single cells, until we get to multicellularity here. And things here are kind of in between. And I wanted to show you dictostillum, which is right here. This is a cellular slime mold, and I wanted to show you some of they're somewhere halfway house between single cells and multicellular. And this is a movie. So each one of these things are a single cell of dictostillum discoideum under starvation conditions. So they don't have enough food. They're looking around for food. And they will aggregate to form a migrating slug and then a fruiting body. So this is like single cells, things getting together, forming something, and then swimming away. And that's, I hope it will, yes. So here they are. They're looking around for food, trying to find some food, and talking to each other, sending out signals. And they'll start to aggregate right here if you look for a while. And this is called, again, a dictostillum. This is a famous example of something halfway in between a single-cell creature and a multicellular creature. And I think it tells us something about the origin of multicellularity. I'm not quite sure what, though. And we're interested in multicellularity because that's the kind of extraterrestrial we want to find out there. We don't want to find these bacteria. We want to find something multicellular. So here they are getting together. And then they form one object. And then watch this. It starts to swim away. And watch what the cells that get left behind. I was always curious about this. See, it starts to swim away. It's a slug. It's out of focus here. But then these guys start to get left behind. Watch this. It goes boink and just starts swimming away. And these guys kind of panic. They say, hey, wait for me, wait for me. And then it settles down, it spirals up, settles down, and then forms a stalk. And at the end of that stalk, it has some germ cells. Those germ cells are what gets passed on, and everything else has sacrificed itself to pass on the germ cells of its buddies. So that's what's called stalk altruism. In any case, and that's what your body is. You have a soma, and your cells, about 2 billion years ago, signed a contract that said, you can have sex, but you will die, and you must help pass on your germline. That's the contract that happened about 2 billion years ago on Earth. And whether that is something that we should expect elsewhere in the universe is, I'm not sure. But it's one of the major features of the evolution of life on our planet. Okay, so if you're interested in more, read this book, Sex and the Origins of Death. And then, if you were in high school, you probably looked at these paramecium, and they have, you know how we have two sexes, male and female? Some species of ciliates have 100 sexes. So now, you know, if you're looking for a potential mate, 50% of the population is a potential mate for you. With these guys, if there are 100 sexes, 99% of the population around you are potential mates. I'm not sure what that says, but if you're interested in this, look at the micronucleus, which is the germ line, and macronucleus is the somatic line, and both of them are inside this paramecium. So that's, I think, what I wanted to say about that. Now, species, just like organisms, are born and die. Here's this big thing that killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, a Chicxulub crater in the Yucatan. And here is a big thing. Now, this happened about 4 billion years ago. No, 4.5 billion years ago. This was a moon-forming impact. So we have an object about the size of Mars smashed into the Earth. When it did that, it had so much kinetic energy that if there was an ocean there, all of that ocean would have been vaporized, and the whole planet would have been covered in a silicate atmosphere, so liquid rock or vapor rock for about a few thousand years or so. And so that's a big, probably a a terrestrial life sterilizing impact that happened a long time ago. So if there was life on Earth that early, it probably got sterilized. But as time went on, the impacts got smaller, and the one that happened about 65 million years ago was probably something of that size, which killed the dinosaurs and let us, well, it was responsible for the mammalian radiation, and which we are part of. Okay, now what about the bombardment rate? So if you're going to kill things on Earth, let's look at, we use the moon as a bombardometer. So here's 3.1 billion years ago, 3.5, 4.1 billion years ago. Here's the log of the number of craters, so how many things are banging into the moon. Here we just look at the moon, you can see that the moon is a wonderful attic, a wonderful recording, the bombardometer of the early solar system. And here we have these craters, and we can see that this was going up. Because the Earth is bigger, it has more mass, it focuses these things that are going to impact it, and so you have about many more impacts on the Earth than you have on the Moon. So the Earth will likely suffer about 10 impacts by objects more massive than any that strike the Moon. And the objects that strike the Moon are on the order of 500 kilometers, and that's easy enough to, an object of that size has so much kinetic energy coming in at about 10 kilometers a second or so, that would vaporize the surface. Some people say, well, if there's life on Earth and an object like that comes in, it vaporizes, turns the whole surface into a lava ocean. Well, maybe when it hit those rocks had bacteria in them, they went into orbit, and then the Earth cooled down. A few thousand years later, it was cool enough, the rock fell back to Earth and reseeded the population of the life on Earth. Now, I should point out that if you have any questions, why don't you just call them out? Because that's what I like to do in a lecture. So let me, anybody have any questions about that? Just call out if you do. Don't be afraid to interrupt. Okay, I'll continue. Well, this is a Gary Larson cartoon that I like so much. We can also make ourselves go extinct. So in addition to those bombardments, I should point out that we are very sensitive to being killed by bombardments, just like the dinosaurs. But the bacteria, they will live on. They've been on the planet for about 4 billion years, and we've only been here for about 200,000. So that is a measure of how robust we are. We think we have big brains and we're good, but every time we go to the moon, there are many more bacteria going to the moon with us. In any case, if we have warfare, pollution, we may not survive. What we means we humans. So maybe we should go to another terrestrial planet. We should find one soon, and in the next 1,000 years to 1,000,000 years, get there to avoid the island effect. When species get isolated to islands, they're easy to go extinct. They go extinct more easily than things that are widely spread. And so if we can find another terrestrial planet around, and I think there are lots of them around, then we might ensure our legacy. Okay, so what about the sun? Now, here's a picture that astronomers use to talk about the sun. It's called an HR diagram. On this axis, we have temperature. Here's 3,000 Kelvin. Here's 30,000 Kelvin. These OB stars are the bright, they're very hot. Here are the cool ones. Now, our star is right here, the sun. It's a G-type star. And here's the luminosity. Now, notice that you can be cool and be luminous because you're so big. So here's the 1 solar radius. See 1 solar radius here? Here's 10 solar radius, much bigger stars. Here's 100 solar radius. Here's 1,000. So Betelgeuse, that red giant in Orion, has a radius that's about 1,000 times the radius of the sun. So if the sun is a millimeter, then Betelgeuse is a meter stick. All right, so now the sun this is the main sequence, and that's where these stars are turning hydrogen into helium. But the sun started out over here, went zoop on a Hayashi track to get here, and then in the future, it's slowly climbing up and slowly climbing up right here, and it's getting bigger and bigger as it does. Now that's important for us because the sun's luminosity affects the temperature of the Earth. And so what the sun came from over here, went to here, burning for about 10 or 11 billion years, and then it starts to climb up the red giant branch here, and it gets bigger, it gets 10 times, it gets 100 times. Now when I say 100 times, you should ask the question, well, wait a minute, how many solar radii are we from the sun? Right? Because if the sun is turning into a red giant, isn't that going to engulf us? Well, I'll be talking about some of the evidence whether the Earth will or will not get engulfed. But Mercury and Venus are toast. They're going to get engulfed. Anyway, the sun goes like this, goes like this, goes like this, and then it goes, boop, it pushes out a lot of mass here, it looks and turns into a planetary nebula, and then comes down here, cools into a white dwarf, and then cools forever, or until it falls into the central black hole of the galaxy. Okay, so that's called the post-main sequence, what's going to, stellar evolution, what's going to happen to the sun. Now, let's look at, here's another version of the same thing, a linear version. Here's the sun, here's it is today. It's burned about half of its fuel. This is how much hydrogen it has left in its core. And then it goes like this, it puffs up a little bit, then it turns into a red giant, and here's the part that could get dangerous for the Earth. And then it goes into a planetary nebula, and then it turns into a white dwarf, and then it cools like an ember of a fire, cooling down. It has no longer any fusion going on in its core. Now, sometimes when you say, well, how long until the sun turns into a red giant? It's going to be 5 billion years from now. And I went to a school, and I said this, and then one student says, whoa, for a second I thought you said 5 million years. Now the reason that's funny is because the lifetime of this person is only 100 years. But imagine if the lifetime of a human being were 10 million years. Well, then that doesn't make sense, I guess. Or maybe that does make sense. It makes more sense. If you're going to live 10 million years, then, hey, you care about 5 million. But if you're only going to live 100, 5 billion, 5 million, what's the difference? Okay, so here's our stars being born, and we think that the sun was probably born something like this. There's a molecular core here, molecular cloud here. There are about, I don't know, a few hundred, maybe a few thousand stars here. Maybe one of them, this is about 4.5 billion years ago, one of them is the sun. So the sun has a bunch of siblings that were formed simultaneous with it, and since in the last 5 billion years have been spread out all over the galaxy. So the stars are born out of molecular clouds that are in the plane of the galaxy. And I wanted to show these. They're such pretty images of planetary. So stars die, they lose mass, and then they form, the mass loss produces these planetary nebulae. And they're so pretty. Look at these things here. Look at this one here. Anyway, the sun will produce something like that during its planetary nebula phase. All right. So here's some data. Now, here's today. Here's a billion years after well, we'll start over here. Here's 0. Here's the sun formed. And then here's 100 million years later. Is a billion years later. And here we are 4.56 billion years after the formation of the sun. And here are the models for the luminosity, solar luminosity. And you see here we are at 1. So today has just been normalized to 1. Now look what happens in the future. The luminosity goes up and up and up and up and up. Now remember, this is a log plot. So this is 10 billion years. So here we are about halfway through 10 billion. So this amount of time is the same as that amount of time. So the luminosity of the sun is increasing. What's that going to do to the Earth? Well, here's a picture of what's called the habitable zone. Here we have Venus's orbit right here, 0.7 AU, the Earth's orbit, 1 AU, Mars' orbit, 1.5 AU. And the habitable zone is kind of defined as where you could have this. Liquid water at the surface. You have to be in a temperature regime. You also have to have some pressure to keep it liquid. And so that's how the habitable zone around a star is defined. So if you can imagine if you have a star here and your planet is here, well, it's too hot for water. Here you can have water, and here you just have ice. And so there's a regime called the habitable zone where you can have liquid water at the surface of the planet. Now, because the sun's luminosity is increasing, the habitable zone is getting further and further away. That's what it's getting further and further away. It goes up and up and up, and pretty soon, in about, let's say, 1 billion or 2 billion years from now, the Earth will no longer be in the habitable zone, and we will no longer have this. So that's going to happen. There's no getting around that. You can't just turn down the thermostat of the sun. So it will increase. As a matter of fact, if you take this further, it increases so fast that the habitable zone first makes Mars a good place to be, and then it makes Jupiter, Neptune, Uranus very good places to be, and then even the Kuiper belt will turn into a habitable zone. And if life can get started on Earth, well, maybe it can get started in the Kuiper belt. Kuiper belt are the objects that are beyond Neptune. So Pluto and Charon and all the other objects out there. Any questions? Okay. I'll move on then. So here's something interesting now, and that is that there's a guy named Lovelock. I'm not sure. How many of you have heard of the Gaia hypothesis? Okay, about a third of the audience. All right, so this guy is like the founder of the Gaia hypothesis, and he wrote a paper in 1982 about the lifespan of the biosphere, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Here's today, here's 1 billion years ago, 2 billion, 3 billion, and here's 1 billion years into the future. Now, the luminosity of the sun is on this axis, so it started out at about 30% less than it is today. There's today's luminosity, here it was when it started out. So the luminosity of the sun has increased by about 30% over its lifetime. So that's what this line says. Oh, increasing, 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 increasing. And it will continue to increase. Now, what about the CO2? Now, you know that the CO2 is a greenhouse gas. And so if it's too cool, and you put greenhouse gas there, it will make it warm. And so that's essentially what he proposes, that in the early time, there was enough CO2 and greenhouse gas to make us warm. Now, this is the temperature here. And you can see the temperature of the Earth is very crudely estimated, but the bottom line is that it's consistent with having been pretty much the same temperature. So there's some type of thermal regulation that has acted over the past 4 billion years. We have evidence for liquid water at about 4.3 billion years from zircons. There's a type of rock that are very well preserved, tiny little pieces. So the temperature has stayed about the same, even though the sun has increased by 30% in luminosity. If we didn't have CO2 coming down, then the Earth's temperature would go, whoo, it would be way down here. It would be an ice planet. But because there's lots of CO2, that provides lots of greenhouse gases, that warms the Earth, and then that keeps the temperature about the same here. Now, the problem is that these guys, these are stomata. If you go outside, you'll see green plants. Green plants have stomata. That's where they breathe. That's, we breathe through our noses and mouths. Well, they breathe through these little holes. They're called stomata. Here's a picture. And what they're doing is they're not breathing oxygen. They're breathing CO2. They take the CO2 and then some light, and then it turns it into glucose. That's what the word photosynthesis means. It's not a photovoltaic cell. You're synthesizing carbohydrates with light and CO2. So all the carbon in your body and all the carbon in the plants outside came from these holes as CO2. Now, if you're decreasing the CO2, you're essentially suffocating the plants. If the CO2 level goes down and down and down and down, they say they don't have enough CO2. And as a matter of fact, we have evidence that plants have been trying their best to extract as much CO2 as possible in the evolution of C3 plants to C4 plants. The problem is that there's some type of lower limit here. We could probably live with 20% oxygen or 19% oxygen, but you get lower. I'm not sure does anybody know what the lowest amount of oxygen in the atmosphere you can have and still breathe okay? Is that 10% or anybody know that? 11? Anybody a mountaineer that climbed up and saw? Anyway, I don't know. But in any case, as CO2 goes down, this process starts to shut down, and we have a CO2 limit. So we cannot continue to decrease the CO2 to make up for the increasing luminosity. This is a compensation that doesn't work because there's a bottoms out here because plants need the CO2. And so what's to be done? Well, let's look at CO2 over the past 600 million years. And so here's CO2 levels, and you can see they've been coming down, just like I showed you in the previous plot. Now here, so this is 100 million years ago, 600 million years ago. I turned this around so I could have the time axis in the same way, so you have to read backwards. Global sea level fluctuations. And on the x-axis here is exon sea level change. So here we are at 0. If the the water sea level used to be like 200, 250 meters higher. Here it was like 400 meters higher. So there was no snow caps on the Earth. And so the idea of having snow caps, there are snow caps here, but the rest of the time the Earth did not have snow caps. So the idea of having polar ice caps is something that's fairly recent and kind of is a minority. It's not something that occurs a lot on the Earth, but that's where we're born, and so we think it's the status quo. But anyway, the CO2 is coming down, down, down. Now I'm going to show you. Now this is 100. Well, this is like 100 million years. So 10 to the 8 years. And now I'm going to show you 100 years. So 1,000,000 times smaller scale than this. And when you do that, this is what you got. This is 1960 to 2000. Everything is a year here, and you can see it going up and up and up and up. And here's the recent sea level rise from 1880 to 2000. It's going up and up and up and up. So the point is that we're producing all this CO2, and what's happening then is as the sun increases its luminosity, not only is it not going up, the CO2 is not going down, the CO2 is going up, and that produces a lot of heat. Now, one other thing that you want to know about destroying the Earth is that the Earth has an atmosphere, and then it has what's called a lapse rate. So here's the temperature at the surface, about 15 degrees, and here's the altitude, sea level. Here's 1 kilometer, 10 kilometers. When you ride in an airplane, you fly here, and here's Mount Everest. If you climb up Mount Everest, it's like 8 or 9 kilometers high. But when you climb up there, it gets really cold, and that's why this line goes this way. Now, interestingly, when air gets cold, it doesn't hold as much water. So almost all the water vapor on Earth is down here, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, in any case, beneath this 10, and so it's protected. This water is protected from UV photons. UV photons have lots of energy. They take an H2O molecule and break it in half to an H and an OH, and then the H escapes. If the water can get up here, the H will escape, and then the planet loses hydrogen. And when your planet loses hydrogen, it loses its water, because H equals H2O equals water. So that's the type of thing we want to prevent. And if you increase the temperature, then you put more water vapor into the atmosphere because hotter air holds more water. And then you get water up here, and then it starts to leak out of the Earth. And that's what you want to prevent if you're a water-based life form, like all terrestrial life is. Now, here are predictions about the temperature as a function of time. So here's today. Here's 1 billion years from now, 2 billion years from now. There are a bunch of papers of people who are concerned about what's going to happen to the biosphere in about 1 billion years. And you can see that the temperature, about 15 degrees, goes all the way up in about 1 billion or 1.5 billion years. That's when the temperatures go so high that there can no longer be life on Earth. And, well, there'll be this CO2 starvation that I mentioned. And then you'll have the high temperatures here. And then you lose water, and then your planet dies. So this is a much smaller time frame. 1 billion or 1.5 billion is a much smaller time frame than the time frame in which the Earth may get engulfed by the expanding sun. So let's talk about that expanding sun again. So the sun loses about 1/3 of its mass here, it puffs it out, and then it turns into a red giant. And then the question is, will the sun engulf the Earth? Now, when people do this calculation, so here's in the future, so 12 billion years, when the sun is 12 billion years old, remember it's 4.56 billion years old now, so 6 billion years from now it'll do this. It'll start to increase the radius, this is the sun's radius, get higher and higher and higher. Then it will lose 10% of its mass. Then it will lose 20% of its mass. Then it will lose 30% of its mass. As it's doing that, the Earth goes away because the radius, the orbital radius, goes as 1 on m, where m is the mass of the sun. So in other words, if here's the sun, and here's the Earth going around, the sun loses mass, and then the Earth gets further away. And that's what this equation says. So this calculation of the Earth getting farther enough away, and notice that the sun's radius goes up to here, but the Earth has escaped and got up higher. So if you do not include tidal drag, the Earth gets to escape, and it doesn't get engulfed like Mercury and Venus. But there's something called tidal drag. How does that work? Well, you may know that the moon is receding at about the same rate that your fingernails are growing, a centimeter or a few centimeters per year. And the reason it's doing that is because here's the Earth is spinning, and a day is much longer than a month. The moon produces this bulge, which then gets pulled around by the spinning of the Earth. There's friction. So the Earth's spin pulls this bulge around, and then this bulge, which is the nearest to the moon, has a vector in this direction, which makes the moon recede. So there's a transfer of angular momentum from the spin of the Earth to the moon. The moon is receding. We can measure that with laser reflection off the surface of the moon. The reflectors were put there by the Apollo astronauts. Now imagine if the Earth's day was longer than a month. Then this bulge would not be pulled along this way. It would be pulled the other way. So now we're going to replace this with the sun. This is going to be the sun. This is going to be the Earth. The Earth produces a bulge on the sun. But the sun has just gotten gigantic. Its period is no longer 28 days or 29 days, but rather almost infinite, like thousands of years. So it's not spinning very fast. And so the bulge, and this is still going around once a year, and so the bulge is retarded compared to the line here. So instead of pointing in this direction, the bulge is pointing in this direction. That means that there's a bulge here that's pulling on the Earth, and that is what's causing the tidal drag that's going to make the Earth come in as opposed to the moon going out. Is that clear? I don't know whether that's a difficult concept or not, but anyway, maybe I'll go like this and say, is that clear again? So it's an important idea of tidal bulges being pulled around by the spin of the Earth or being retarded by the lack of spin of the central body. So if the Earth rotated once every 2 months instead of once every day, then that bulge here would be pointing in this direction. Then the near side of the bulge would be pulling the moon backwards, and the moon would be coming in. It would be approaching us rather than receding. As long as the day is shorter than the month, the moon will recede. And since the sun will blow up, its period will get gigantic, then you're in the situation where the period of the central body is larger, that causes a drag, and the sun will pull in the Earth. And instead of having this, with the Earth escaping, you have this, engulfment. And this is what's going to happen when the sun is about 2.1 or 2.2 billion years old. And if you're interested in the details of that, here's the paper that produced this diagram. Any questions about that? Well, it's it's kind of the tidal drag effect. It's the tidal bulge either spinning in front of you or getting pulled back. Okay, so there's going to be a last day on Earth. There it is. And remember, that is about 6 billion years into the future. I just showed you evidence that at about 1.5 billion is the temperature is going to go up because the sun's luminosity is increasing. So what I just showed you is kind of irrelevant. Even though it's kind of nice to know that, yes, the Earth will be engulfed.
So if we manage to control the carbon dioxide, is that going to keep the sun's temperature regulated even if the luminosity is going down?
Well, what you're asking is if we manage to keep on this going down, well, then you're hitting the CO2 limit when you're suffocating the plants. And so you're turning off the biosphere, main source of energy, if you do that. Okay. So tidal drag. So now you know about the moon receding, and you know about tidal drag producing. Now I was going to say it's an interesting thing. In the early Earth, you had some atmosphere which was controlling the friction of the Earth, and so the weather on the Earth was controlling the recession of the moon, which is a kind of a weird thing. But science is so beautiful. Okay. So here's some stars. Now stars are burning hydrogen to helium. Now you may know that when you drive a car, that the gas tank gets empty after a while. All of these cars are driving, and their gas tank is getting empty. So this is such a beautiful picture. Let's have a closer look at it. Now, so these stars are essentially running out. They're dying. That's what happens to a car when you can't put in more fuel in it. And so all over the universe, stars are burning the hydrogen into helium, hydrogen into helium, hydrogen into helium. And so the global, the universal supply of hydrogen is starting to run down. And now after you burn hydrogen to helium, you start to turn helium into something else, carbon, oxygen, etc. But eventually you're going to run out of sources. Now, there's one concept, tidal drag is one concept, but there's another concept that I think is important. And that is, when you say, if you study physics, they tell you energy is conserved. But then you read in the newspaper, wasting energy. And if energy is conserved, by definition, you cannot waste it, I think. But here's the difference. If you fill this room with plasma at 1 billion degrees, there's lots and lots and lots of energy, but you can't use any of it because there's no gradient. If you fill this side of the room with 1 billion degree plasma and this side with 2 degree plasma, that is what you call free energy. That you can use. You can make it push a piston. The pressure is so high. There's a pressure gradient. So having energy is not what you need. You need free energy. And there's a very subtle distinction, a very important distinction between them, because the energy of the universe is not changing, but the free energy is what's going down. You guys get that? It's important. So energy is not equal to free energy. So, all right, so the galaxies are doing the same thing. So galaxies are made out of stars. These are all galaxies except for that thing and that thing and that thing and that thing. Right? See the diffraction gradient? Those are the stars in this field. This is the ultra deep field. And everything else that doesn't have that square pattern, that cross, is a galaxy of, I don't know, 100 billion stars or so. And they're doing the same thing. They're burning their hydrogen into helium, and they're running out. It's running down. They're dying. But also, they're collapsing, as I described earlier. The mass is going towards that black hole, and then they'll fall into the black hole. And then someday, these will all peter out, and it'll all go black. And that's one way to describe the dying of the universe. And all the matter will fall into black holes, and there'll be supermassive black holes. And so that would be the death of a galaxy, but also the death of the universe, because the source of free energy will have disappeared. Now, for me to go like this, blah, 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 and to you to look over at the screen and to think, that all requires free energy. That's why you had to eat this morning. And notice you can't eat your own poop. You can't eat pee and poop because that doesn't have the free energy. You need that wheat, and that wheat got there because there was sunlight that came into the plant and produced carbohydrates, which you then take with oxygen, and that's how you get the free energy. But if you take this chemical at equilibrium, you cannot extract any free energy out of it. And so that's the lesson, don't eat, yeah. Okay. So, but the universe is also running down. This is called the second law of thermodynamics. It says the universe runs down. There's no free lunch. You're using up the free energy. You're not using up the energy, you're using up the free energy. You turn that hydrogen into helium. And here's a galaxy. It's got I don't know, maybe a 3 or 4 or 10 million solar mass black hole in the center. And this spiral structure is kind of like an accretion disk, and not all, but a large fraction of that mass in 10 to the 14, 10 to the 20 years will fall in slowly. And in about, I guess, 10 to the 100 years, the universe will be, there won't be any stars, but you'll just have these supermassive black holes, which will then evaporate. And I guess I wanted to show you a simulation of so this is gravitational collapse, and how galaxies form. So this is all matter, and it's falling in and falling in. One thing it has to do to fall in is you have to export angular momentum. But anyway, this is like the galaxy forming, and things are falling in and creating a black hole in the center, and then that black hole accretes and accretes and accretes and accretes, and then gets bigger. And this is about 10 billion years. If you think this is long, this is 10 billion years. It's really sped up. And that's today. Okay, now, and what it turns into is here in a Virgo cluster, we're at the outskirts of the Virgo cluster. We have a local group, our galaxy, and then there's the Andromeda galaxy, and then about a couple of dozen smaller things. And all of that is falling towards the Virgo cluster. And at the center of the Virgo cluster is a galaxy called M87, which has 7 billion solar mass black hole. And if you're Stephen Hawking, you can convert that to entropy. And so the entropy of us is proportional to the mass squared. And so black holes have lots and lots of entropy. There's another way to say that. And so gradually the entropy of the universe is increasing through the accretion of mass into black holes. Now black holes evaporate, and when they do evaporate, they will produce photons that are very long wavelength, and then the universe will be a cold gas of photons. There'll be energy there, but there will be no free energy. Yes?
If nothing can escape a black hole, how can it evaporate?
You'd have to talk to Stephen Hawking about that. You'd have to Google. I can wave my hands a little bit, but Google the Hawking radiation. It has to do with the gradient of the gravitational field at the event horizon, and then you have particle creation. You produce a particle and an antiparticle. One of those particles escapes, and then the other falls in, and that's how a black hole loses the gravitational gradient entropy. And look it up. It's hard. But there's one thing that's important, and that is, what is the entropy of the universe? Now, a couple of years ago, I got interested in this question of the entropy of the universe. The second law says that entropy is increasing, so let's compare. I did a literature search to try to find out who's looked at this entropy of the universe problem. And these guys have looked at it, and here's now, and here's T recombination. So here's, between here and here is like 13.8 billion years. And these guys say that the entropy of the universe is like this, but the maximum entropy has gone up. And so this free energy that I've been talking about is proportional to this delta S, this entropy gap. You need an entropy gap because if you're in equilibrium, there's no free energy available. You need to have some type of gap here. And so these guys think that, well, there was an equilibrium and then they diverged here and there's an entropy gap which is going away, and then here you reach the heat death, and that's when the universe dies. You have no more free energy. Even the extraterrestrials, who are billions of times smarter than we are, can't get around the second law, right? And this is the second law saying, hey, entropy is increasing, it's approaching its maximum, there's equilibrium, and equilibrium is death. You are far from equilibrium, dissipative structure, and you're only alive today because we have energy gradients around that we can feed off of, like the wheat that you had for breakfast that came from the photon, that came from the hydrogen turning into helium, which is there because there was a gravitational collapse that formed the star, the sun. So here's our version of the same thing. Is there some maximum entropy that the universe can reach? And then here we are petering along here, and here we are today, and there's still this gap here. And as long as that gap is there, we can still give lectures and eat. But in about 10 to the 100 years, 10 to 110 years, then it will be in equilibrium, and that will no longer be available to us. And that looks like that's the death of the universe.
Is there still the same amount of energy at the end of the whole process, but just not the free energy?
That's debatable. I would say yes. That's a zeroth order approximation. But the concept of total energy of the universe in general relativity is a difficult concept. And I don't want to go there. Just think, sure. Okay. So now here's some universes. We have some theories today that suggest that we need quantum mechanics to talk about the origin of the universe. We can't just look at galaxies or the cosmic microwave background. We want to talk about the earlier universe, and to do that we need general relativity combined with quantum mechanics. When you do that, it suggests that the origin of our universe implies the origin of other universes. And so if you take that idea seriously, and most people in the field do, then you can talk about, oh, here's a universe here, it expanded and then it collapsed. And so it was born, it lived, and then it died. Same thing here. Born, lived, and then it died. In our universe, now this thing dies in a big crunch. It gets hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. But you'd think, oh, there's more energy available. No, there's not more energy available. There's the same amount of energy. It's getting hotter, but that you can't do anything with that heat because it's like filling up this room with plasma. You can't do anything with that heat. You need temperature gradients. That's the difference between free energy and energy. So although these things are collapsing, you think, oh, they're getting hotter, therefore that's energy. No, it's not. It's not free energy that you can do anything with. So our universe is something like this. It's getting bigger, and then recently, about 10 years ago or so, we found out that the universe is accelerating. And so it's flattening out like this. And then that's the type of universe that leads to equilibrium heat death. And the temperature of the microwave background, which is now about 3 degrees, goes down to 2 degrees, goes down to 1 degree, goes down to 10 to the minus 10 degrees, goes down to 10 to the minus 20 degrees. Soon it gets beneath the temperature of those most massive black holes, and that's when the black holes start to evaporate. That's why this 10 to the 100 years from now, that's how long it takes to get the microwave background down to the temperature of a billion solar mass black hole. So universes are born and they die. And here's a picture of this quantum foam. And here's a universe that's born and then it dies, and born and dies. And then here's our universe is born, it's getting bigger and bigger, and then it turns into heat death. And it dies that way. It's a different type of death. So universes, like people, like planets and stars, also die. It's basically a result of the second law of thermodynamics that is a special kind of law because it's A, it's approximate, and B, it's more like mathematics. It's more like statistics. It's not really a property of the universe. It's more like a property of statistics. And I talked to Paul Steinhardt a couple of weeks ago, and he wrote this book with Neil Turok about the endless universe. So he has a universe that goes like boing, big bang, big crunch, big bang, big crunch. And so he has these are like different disconnected universes, and who knows which one you're in. But the problem here is, how do you, the entropy is increasing, entropy is increasing, entropy is increasing, entropy is increasing, and it continues to increase. So he's got to figure out a way to decrease the entropy. He's got to figure out a way to violate the second law of thermodynamics to have anything interesting happening here. Otherwise, you just have you have energy, but no free energy. To get free energy, you have to decrease the entropy. And that is something that no one knows how to do. He waves his hands a little bit. We argued about it for an hour, but I recommend to read the book and see what you think. But the second law is something that's very, very fundamental, and that's probably, if there's anything wrong with this model, that is what is wrong with it. So here's a picture of the multiverse. This is inspired by Linde's ideas about eternal inflation. So here's our universe. Actually, this is a blow-up of that tiny section. Here we are in our galaxy. Here's our observable universe. The entire universe, our universe, is much, much bigger than our observable universe. So these galaxies over here, there maybe there's some life form over here with telescopes. They have an observable universe like this. And anyway, this thing expanded, and so it's so big. And then when we form a black hole or something, then we produce another baby universe, and here's our mother universe, and here's our sibling universe. And so the whole thing is a family affair. And that's one picture of the multiverse. And the question is the multiverse going to die? Excuse me. Thanks for that carbonated water. Okay. I don't have any idea whether that question makes sense or not. The second law certainly applies, but as to whether when you form another universe, whether you started out at low entropy or not, and how you do that is a more difficult question to answer. So I did want to end on a perspective that an alien might have. And just like us, we think we're going to live forever. Somehow that seems to be built into us. Maybe that helps us survive, thinking that we're going to live forever. But it's obviously not true. And I thought that this alien could teach us something about that as well. Because I think he thinks he's going to live forever too. I think that is telling us something about the human condition. I'm not quite sure what it is, but we may be in a similar situation. But I wanted to end with this picture here. No picture has ever been taken from further away. This is the pale blue dot that Carl Sagan convinced NASA to turn the Voyager spacecraft around and take this picture. So that's us. That's our pale blue dot, and Carl wrote about it. We succeeded in taking this picture from deep space. You see a dot That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever lived out their lives on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity and all this vastness, there's no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. And I think Carl Sagan is somebody who got me interested in cosmology, and maybe that's why I'm standing here in front of you. I think he's a wise man. And thank you for your attention.